Hey, what's up? Here we are with another episode of What's Up Conversations. Recently, I've been playing Ghost of Tsushima and I'm loving it so much. The sound work in this game is remarkable and it really helps the story and the overall atmosphere. So to understand the tricks behind the sound of this game, I had a chat with Bradley Meyer, audio director of Ghost of Tsushima at Sucker Punch. We talked about Bradley's career, the ins and outs of the industry, and of course, his toolsets and techniques. Thank you again, Bradley, and a special thanks to Sony for making this possible. Make sure to follow What's Up Conversations on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me on Twitter at @HRNikofar, or you can find out more about What's Up Conversations on my website, www.nikofarmusic.com. Thank you very much. Let's get to it. Hello and welcome to What's Up Conversations, Brad. It's so great to have you on the show. So, congratulations on the successful release of Ghost of Tsushima. I'm having so much fun with this game. And in my opinion, this is one of the best audio works of this generation. A perfect marriage between gameplay, ambience, music, impactful combat-driven sounds. And I'm so impressed with the mix of this game and the logic and formulas you guys have created to make the experience as unique as possible. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, okay, Brad, let's talk about you. Where were you born and how did life take you to this journey of becoming an audio artist?
Well,
Take your time.
So I was born in the state of New Jersey, and I moved to Atlanta, Georgia when I was a year and a half old. And so I grew up there until I was 10. And that was actually, I guess, where I first started my explorations into sound. I used to just love playing records when I was, 3 years old. I was already just enraptured by just playing records constantly. And then when I turned 5, this crazy thing called MTV came out, and I was addicted to that. I think I went to kindergarten for like 4 hours a day, and if I wasn't at school, I was watching MTV. And then from there, I just started playing around with cassette tapes, and ended up moving to Southern California near San Diego when I was 10. And so I would do stuff like in both those places. I mean, like me and my brother would make these goofy little like radio plays where we would just like make up stories and record them on cassettes and add little sound effects. And then, later on I got into like, kind of doing really rudimentary editing all on cassettes and like making weird remixes or just doing strange tape loops. And, fast forward another dozen years and I started finally, making a lot more of my own music. And I got a sampler, a Roland S50, which was a 12-bit sampler, and just doing lots of weird experimental stuff with that. So I'd always really been into sound, and the only real avenue that I knew was music. So that was kind of where I was always kind of focusing a lot of my time. And then I graduated college. I went to UC Berkeley, and I graduated college and was unemployed for a month and got really bored. So I went to a temp agency and I walked in and they said, "Oh, you look like a freak. You should work at Berkeley Systems." And I was like, "Okay, well, what's Berkeley Systems?" "Oh, it's a video game company up the street." So I ended up working there just as a temp, and I was doing all kinds of odd jobs. Just like, actually, my first job there was awful. They had just gotten bought by a company, and as a result had to lay off a bunch of people. So my first job there was to go through everybody's desk who got laid off and organize the pens and the pencils and the paper clips and everything. But somebody left a gong, and so I asked if I could keep the gong, and they said yes. And that gong made its way into Ghost of Tsushima even. So,
No way.
but so for some reason they really liked me, and they kept me on there just doing these odd jobs and like working the front desk, and eventually they just hired me into their shipping department. So I was the shipping guy, and but I was really like very vocal about like, "Hey, look, I'm this really smart kid." I was just so full of myself. It was embarrassing to think about now, but I was like, "You guys should give me something creative to do." And I had no skills. And so eventually I talked to their sound designer. And this guy, he had his own room. There's a light bulb, a red light above his office that I guess would turn on when he was doing stuff, but he wasn't really there much. But anyway, he was there one day, and we started talking. He's like, "Oh, come on, let's go out to lunch. I'll tell you a little bit about what I do." And so he told me about MIDI, which I'd never heard of, and we just started chatting a bit. And I was just like, "Wow, that's fascinating," and never thought anything more about it. And then like another couple weeks later, the vice president of product development calls me into his office, and the sound designer's name was PJ, and he's like, "So we just fired PJ. Apparently, he hadn't been coming into the office for months and months, and so they basically, had to outsource all of their sound work, and they figured like, yeah, this isn't working. So they're like, and we hear you're into sound. What kind of experience do you have?" So I did what just came to me through. I worked an internship at a TV station and was talking to an editor like the year before. I was like, "Man, you have the coolest job. How did you learn to do this?" He's like, I lied. I went in for a job interview. I told them I knew what I was doing, and then they gave me the job, and then I went in the next day and taught myself how to do all this stuff. So that was in the back of my head when he asked me what experience I had. So I told him, "Oh, I've got tons. I've done all these student films and blah blah blah." And really all I've done is playing with my samplers and fork tracks and stuff. So he's like, "Okay, well, why don't you go home and bring us a demo tomorrow, and we'll see." So I ran home that night and I grabbed a couple things that I had written before, and I wrote some other stuff. I think I claimed that some of that was from a student film, which it wasn't. I'd never used a computer related to sound at this point in my ever. So other than like programming in BASIC and just saying like play A30 or whatever. But so I brought in the cassette the next day, and then a week later he calls me in again. He's like, "Well, it's nothing you're ever going to hear in any of our games, but it shows you know what you're doing, so you got the job." And so just being in the right place at the right time, and then the fact that PJ hadn't been coming in for so long, and they farmed out all their work for 6 months, basically gave me this buffer to lock myself in that office and teach myself, well, what is MIDI, and how do I record sound effects, and what the hell am I doing? And so, I started instantly with imposter syndrome. It was half like, I can't believe that somebody's paying me to make sound effects, to at the same time, like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing, and I don't have any kind of like person or mentor or community I can reach out to figure it out. So I guess I'll just figure it out and hope they don't fire me. And
YouTube
so,
wasn't
yeah,
a thing back then, right?
what's that?
So and YouTube wasn't a thing back there, so you could search
No,
something.
there was, the internet was very, very nasty. I mean, this was in 1998. So yeah, it was just being exceptionally fortunate and lucky that I managed to get into the industry, and it's been an insane learning experience ever since. That's one thing that I don't think would ever stop, that I wouldn't want to stop, is like there's always something new, and whether it's a new technique, a new technology, there's just always something new to learn.
Were you even into video games back then?
It's funny. I was super into video games as a kid. At that point, I wasn't super into them. But it's funny because as a kid, we had an Atari when I was really little, and then got a Nintendo and played a lot of PC games with my dad, my brother. So definitely had a lot of games growing up. And in fact, I was a huge fan of the Sierra games like Police Quest and King's Quest and Space Quest and all those. And so I remember like my brother and I just loved all those games. And like my dream as a kid was to work for Sierra. And when I got hired as a sound designer at Berkeley Systems, they were owned by Sierra. So my very first paycheck had that Sierra logo on it.
Oh, that's
And I
awesome.
was like, oh my God, this is all I ever wanted. So I guess I should just retire. But yeah, there's a long time, in my 20s where I just didn't play games very much, and even now I don't play them a ton. It's usually there'll be like 2 or 3 games that I'll play during the year because I like want to enjoy them. And then there's a handful that I'll play for a bit just to kind of listen to what, people I know or respect, or games that look cool to me, or maybe are in a similar genre, just to hear what people are doing, both on the sound design and the technology side.
So, what was the last game that inspired you audio wise?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of them. Uh, I guess the last game that I was playing is Last of Us 2, which, I mean, the Naughty Dog team is just, listening to any of their games is just a masterclass in just what our craft can be. It's just every minute detail has a level of polish that is fairly unmatched in not just in our industry, but I think in kind of audio in general, in a professional capacity. And so, that game is hard to play because it's very kind of heavy subject matter, but it's also, for me, it's like I'm constantly just like running around and just like fidgeting with things or just stopping and listening. So it's taking me even longer because I'm just like, okay, I want to drag this giant metal crate around and just hear the sounds it's making on all the different surfaces and how those transitions are happening, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So, you're an audio director. Please tell us about your day-to-day duties. What should an audio director do to guarantee consistency between different departments working on the audio experience of a game? For example, music, sound design, sound programming, etc.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so I guess the hardest part of being an audio director is, I don't really get to do a ton of sound design
Yeah.
anymore. And that's something that I've kind of resigned myself to. And I usually try to just like tuck a couple things away in a project. Like, okay, even if everything else goes bad, I'm still going to work on this so I can still make sure I remember how to design. And, there's so much creativity there that I love, and, still try to do a lot of field recording and just as much of that stuff as I can. But, from on a day to day, a lot of my job is really just kind of coordination and facilitation, whether that is, tasking out my team with the things they should be working on that day, or working with the other leads in the studio, finding out what's going on the mission side or the animation side, working with a programmer on the systems that we're trying to build and making sure that that's going smoothly and that we're iterating on that to get the feature working correctly. um, on the music side, we're super fortunate, being part of Sony to have the PlayStation music team. But we're constantly in communication, whether it's about, choosing a composer, or, evaluating music delivery, or actually working with them and the programmers to build the music system for playback. Um, Dialogue is much the same thing. I'm working a lot with the Sony dialogue team, with our writers and producer, just to make sure, the quality is there, that we're trying to do our best to ensure exertion and projection and continuity between lines and across scenes, and that we're taking into account what players can be doing to try to make sure that we're kind of making the game feel as kind of true or real to the player experience as we can. Um, at the same time, another part of my job is just kind of helping on the technical side with my sound designers. I've out of my whole audio team, I've been there the longest, so I know our engine the best, and so I can often help them either kind of rig really kind of more difficult, challenging things, or point them to the right person so that they can kind of get unblocked. It's definitely a lot of production work, in addition to kind of just making sure that everything on the audio side is running smoothly, that communication is happening between the audio team and the rest of the game team, and just trying to keep a bead on everything that's going on, because there's a lot of plates spinning. And then I think kind of the culmination of all that is at the mix, and just needing to know everything that's going on, and where all the events live in the project, and what the busing structure is, and all that kind of stuff. So it's just kind of a matter of just staying on top of everything and trying to make sure things don't slip through the cracks.
Yeah, as you've mentioned, sometimes audio directors are the one who's going to hire a composer for a game. In that case, what are the most what are you most interested in? I mean, and how's the whole process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the project, and usually the hiring a composer is this like vetting process where you might start with listening to demos and kind of hearing like, oh yeah, that person sounds like they could probably do what we want for this project, or oh, that person's got a really unique style. Um, and then you usually kind of interview them and chat with them and kind of feel them out as far as like you might pitch them the game and see how they react to that. And there's definitely something to be said for personality as well. If you're working with somebody who has a huge ego or isn't willing to kind of consider feedback, that might be a really difficult relationship. And I mean, I've had kind of the gamut of composers that I've worked with across my career. Most of them have been absolutely fantastic. Um, but um, but yeah, so that's usually kind of the process. And then once you hire somebody, then it's usually then okay, great. Let's build out the task list of kind of these are the cues that we need. I think for most of my projects, um, the composers haven't been exceptionally well versed in game audio. Um, and kind of the nuances of making an interactive score. But with that said, everybody that I've worked with has picked it up just super well. And again, being at Sony, it's like having that team to kind of help foster the composers through that process and to really guide a lot of that process for the composer is just, it's a huge weight off my shoulders. I was audio director at Activision and was having to own that entire process on top of everything else. And I was actually the one working with the composer on explaining how to compose for interactive music, and then I was the one doing all the editing to make it all fit into the game. So it was just a huge time sink, which was tons of fun. But having this incredible world class team taking that on just makes my life a little bit easier now.
Yeah. So for the sound designers who might be aiming to work in a AAA studio like Sucker Punch, what do you suggest and what are the main qualifications you're interested in when you're working with a sound designer?
So are you talking about like hiring somebody internally or working with an external sound designer?
No, no, hiring someone.
Okay. I mean, again, you know, uh, I think that there's a handful of things. I mean, obviously, talent is crucial, um, but also just the kind of the personality is in some ways at least as important, if not more important. Because again, I mean, Sucker Punch is an exceptionally collaborative studio, and so whether that's a small strike team of us working on a feature that is a little cross-platform team of we got a programmer, an animator, a designer, and a sound person, and we're all kind of working on this one feature to make it viable, or the sound team collaborating. I mean, a lot of the sound design in Ghost, for example, probably went through the hands of 3 or 4 designers before it actually shipped, because we're just constantly dealing with stuff or bouncing off things, or if somebody was doing all of this work and then we want this one aspect of it to sound a little bit differently, let's throw it over to another designer just to get a different take. And it's just I mean, video game development is so collaborative that you really need to have good people that you can communicate with and really work on that stuff with. So our hiring process is maybe a little unique, but I hope it kind of the industry starts to change, because a lot of hiring, you'll see like, oh hey, okay, great, we'll review your stuff, we'll look at your demo, and then here's your test, just do a sound replacement for a trailer, and then if that's good, then we'll move on to 6 hours of really tough interviews. And so what we try to do is, I don't think, unless you're hiring a cinematics person, that's not the best representation of their skills in game audio, because it completely lacks any kind of demonstration of their understanding and knowledge of interactivity. So, and there's also kind of barriers to entry for people too. It's like, somebody might be the most fantastic sound designer, but they might not be able to afford, fancy sound libraries, or, maybe they don't. Well, I guess, with Reaper, anybody can have a DAW at home. So that's less of an issue than it was, 15 years ago. But so we definitely kind of try to democratize it a little bit. And so our tests will include all the WAV files that we want you to use. And we're not telling you how to use them, but basically score this part of this scene or pick a scene, score it with these sounds we provide, and tell us why. Because that's another part of it, is we want people to be able to communicate about the choices that they make, because that's super important, especially when talking to non-sound people, because, we kind of have our own language. And so if you can't explain the choices that you're making, it's going to be really hard for you to be able to explain why or how you need to do something to a mission designer, for example. And so it's a little bit different there. And then the other thing that I do in my in-person interviews, specifically for sound designers, is, again, we love recording our own sounds and doing as much of that as we can. So, part of it is just kind of testing the passion of a person, but, trying to get them comfortable. And then I'll just throw some Foley props onto the table, and then just say, okay, look, there's no grade here. There's no score. I'm not looking for anything, but let's just play around with these things and see what kind of sounds we can make. And so to me, that is, I've had people that have just eaten that up and gotten so into it, and we've just lost ourselves for 45 minutes doing that, which is a ton of fun. But that'll show me not only their passion, but then also that collaborative spirit, because when you're like working with props with another sound designer, somebody might do something, you're like, whoa, what was that? And then that'll give you an idea, like, oh, let me try this. And then, so it just creates this fun synergy. And that, to me, is one of the most critical things for, like, how are we going to work together if we hired you?
Yeah, that is great. So about Ghost of Tsushima, it's a very grounded game audio-wise. How do you balance between a realistic, grounded approach and juiced up cinematic touches?
Totally. I mean, it's definitely probably the most grounded game I've ever worked on, actually. And so it was interesting because at the very beginning, we were really talking a lot across the entire game about how grounded this was. And I think part of that was, as a studio, we were transitioning from the Infamous series, which was obviously super fantastical with these crazy superpowers, to, this very grounded game. And I think at the beginning, I think people were like, okay, sure, we're making a samurai game, but there's going to be like magic and superpowers, right? Because that's what we do. And so it was definitely, we were very clear early on about, like, no, that's not what we're doing. We are making a grounded game. And so, I started that from a very literal perspective of, like, cool, you know what? I mean, one of the first things that we did is we found a Japanese swordsmanship class or studio in the town where we work in Bellevue. And so me and our cinematics lead, we went to a couple of those classes just to kind of watch them and talk to them a bit. And so, yeah, one of the first things I noticed was just the people who were training, when they swung their swords, you could hear them. They made that whoosh. When the masters swung their swords, they were almost silent.
Oh.
And it was like, wow, that's something. That's something we can't do. It's like, okay, we're definitely gonna have to take some steps away from reality right there, because that is not gonna fly if somebody's swinging a sword and it's silent, because that's just reality versus kind of cinematic perception. So there's obviously lots of license that we took there, and so I think we slowly started building from that. It was still like our sword swings and impacts just kind of got bigger and bigger. And this was another example of just tossing it around. I kind of did the first pass of them. And then Josh Lord, my senior sound designer, he did a pass and it made them bigger. And then I went back and took my stuff and made it bigger, just introducing some more layers. And so, our initial swing was just kind of, the sword swings just had like a low and a high whoosh element. And then, Josh, I think, did the Mongol weapons, and they just sounded so much cooler than the hero now. So I had to go back and readdress that. So then I started looking at, okay, what if we add some metallic layers and a little bit of like a Doppler whoosh layer. And then towards the end of the project, when we were polishing everything, we were super fortunate to get Mike Niederquill, who was the lead on God of War and Death Stranding. He joined the team on the Sony side, and him and another sound designer there, Andres Herrera, kind of, did the polish pass. And so they took a lot of the elements that we built and just kind of sweetened them even more. And kind of that is the end result. So a lot of things were, not super processed. I mean, the ambience in the world, most of those birds were, we recorded them in Japan and cleaned up those recordings if they needed to. And, for some of them, maybe we added a little bit of reverb and, some EQ and stuff if we needed, but most of those are just as they were.
Wow.
The Foley, we kind of built this big modular system with all these different kind of clothing types, and we worked with Warner Brothers on the Foley, which was super awesome because Allison D. Moore is just a legendary Foley artist, and to have her kind of doing a lot of our character Foley, I think was another real eye-opening experience for me about, it's something that I've known throughout my career, but having been in this kind of grounded tunnel for so long, it reawakened my sense of like, right, just because you're doing grounded doesn't mean you need to be literal. And that was something that I'd kind of lost over the beginning of the project. And so, seeing them, we show them a picture of the bamboo bridge. And when I was recording stuff on the bamboo, I had some bamboo and I was walking on it. It's like, yeah, that sounds okay, but it's still missing that kind of the character of when you're walking and you're actually hearing and feeling the creaking and the rattling of it. And so, what we did with them is they just kind of like walked around and just found some props. And it's like, okay, well, if I take this pallet and this screen door and wedge a thing in there, it'll make it just rickety enough. And so it was just like magical to kind of see how they were kind of utilizing props to fake these real world scenarios. And that just kind of reinvigorated us to still be using grounded things, but use them in more creative ways.
Oh, that's interesting. So I've been very curious about the UI sound design of Ghost of Tsushima when I started the game for the first time. And I gotta say, it is genius the way you guys glued these sounds perfectly to the grounded style of the whole game. Can you talk about the UI sound design in general? What is the best approach to design this important section of the game?
Yeah, so the UI is so that was basically all done by Josh Lord, and so there's a couple things with the UI that we did. So first off, we wanted the UI sounds to kind of match the visuals, and our UI went through a few different iterations through the project. It was 4.5 years of, okay, we're going to start with a paper map. So we're like, okay, great. And we'll have all these paper elements as UI. Okay, great. So we'll start with paper will be kind of the main source that we record for UI. And then it turned into, this more Game of Thronesy thing. And then it turned into really what it ended up becoming, which is just this beautiful, clean, kind of its own thing. And so what we decided at that point is we were going to kind of meld a lot of organic sounds to kind of be the UI. And so the sounds we still use some paper stuff. We used a little bit of some metallic elements just to kind of harken back to the katana and swords. And we used a lot of musical source. And so it was a lot of different percussive stuff. We actually, one of our composers, Alana Shkeri, actually never had this happen before. It was super generous. He just basically gave us his sample library that he had recorded of all this stuff for the project. So we actually incorporated some of those elements to help also kind of tie it into the score a little bit. And then Josh took all that stuff and just processed it into these kind of new sounds. And part of that processing, the direction for that came from one of our creative directors, Jason Cannell, who he said, "Look, this game is pretty dark. You know, the story is not a happy, really redeeming story. It's a story of struggle. You know, it's struggle on the island. It's struggle for Jin and him trying to resolve, you know, his samurai ways with his ghost methods. So he basically gave us the direction of like, look, I want the UI to feel dark. I want it to match kind of what the player is going through. So Josh took that, you know, to heart and just kind of processed everything to give it this kind of darker feel. So yeah, he just did a really great job of kind of melding all those different things, and I think the UI ended up super strong, and I think we were really fortunate to have him, you know, able to iterate on that and just turn it into what it became.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Kudos to Josh. So, I believe great directors like Akira Kurosawa or Sergio Leone revolutionized sound storytelling in cinema by approaching it as an entirely different tool to tell stories rather than a copying of the visuals. The ability to tell stories that are not visible on the screen requires a lot of focus, proficiency, and above all, a great understanding of the story. I see this quality in your work, and you tell stories audio wise, stories that are sometimes are not necessarily in the visuals. I'm curious about how do you approach this particular way of storytelling with sound?
You know, it is definitely, I'd say it's definitely a very collaborative thing. It's not just like, okay, well, this is the story. How do we want to tell it with sound? You know, it is also a lot of, okay, well, how are we presenting this visually? What is the moment to moment experience that we want the player to be having? You know, all of those things I think coalesce together to figure out how we want to kind of tell the story from the audio perspective. Um, and some of that stuff, you know, comes late. A lot of that stuff is a much more collaborative thing. I mean, I think one example is I was working with our other creative director, Nate Fox, on the beginning of the game. And so an example of that is we have our first cutscene. Apology for spoilers if you haven't played the game and you intend to. So we have this first cutscene is basically setting up the Mongol invasion of the island of Tsushima. And you know, we have beautiful music that just kind of builds to this crescendo as you're about ready to charge down to the beach. And you know, the music team had initially written some music for that charge down to the beach, but I was like, no, we got to remove that because look, we just had some big music and this is the first battle. And like, yes, music would definitely make it feel even bigger and more dramatic, but this needs to be more about these 80 samurai just basically going to face their death. And at the beginning of that scene, you don't know that. You're just like, sweet, I'm going to kill some Mongols. And you know, by the time you're down that hill, half of your team is already wiped out because of explosions, which they'd never seen before. So we really wanted to just make that feel a little bit more visceral by just saying, okay, we're only going to do sound design in this portion. And then at the very end of this scene, where it's basically the final battle of the samurai and the Mongols, and at the end it's just you and your uncle left, we kind of do the inverse, where we start to drop out all the sound design as kind of all the other samurai get killed. And so it basically, you end up just having this really big, powerful music piece and just kind of this like ethereal, reverbed out like vocals and sword hits that you're kind of hearing. And that kind of just makes the whole game at that point you're feeling like the loss and the desperation. You know, you went from this big, heroic, triumphant thing to like, I can't even hear anymore because we are dying. And so, you know, things like that that's part of what I love the most, but it's also, those are generally very collaborative things. And, you know, I don't know that we would have gotten to that if we didn't have all the other elements in place. You know, being able to see how things work enables you to have a little bit more play of like, cool, what happens if we bring the music down here and bring up the sound effects, or vice versa, or we're only hearing dialogue, or whatever you want to do. So it's definitely something that often it'll start as like a little seed when I talk to the writers and get a pitch for a mission or a narrative, or kind of a story arc. And then once we actually start working with the designers, maybe they'll be like, hey, it'd be really cool if we have a little bit of extra space here so we can try this with sound. And it's just this kind of constant iterative process that involves usually most of the teams in the studio.
Yeah, great job. So I get this question a lot from the sound designers that do we need to know how to code to get a job in big studios? What's your answer to that? And please elaborate on the subject.
I would say, do you need to know how to code? Absolutely not, unless you want to be an audio programmer. Do you need to know how to script? In a lot of studios, no. Does it help to know how to script? In all cases, yes. And it's scripting is essentially like coding light, I guess. And there's so many different scripting languages. I mean, in Unity, C# is probably the most popular one, or whether it's JavaScript or Lua. In Unreal, you have essentially a visual scripting language with blueprints. And so I think the important thing there, there are some people who are just pure sound designers, and it's just they're amazing at it, and that's their thing, and that's all they do. And if they can make that work, that's awesome. I'm super happy for them. In a lot of my career, what I've seen the need for is somebody who's a little bit more well-rounded. So it's like, yes, I do the sound design, but I also do the integration. And I think that there's definitely been more growth in the industry of kind of specialization of roles, so that there might be a technical sound designer who they just do the rigging. Meanwhile, this sound designer over here just does the creation of the sound effects that will then he or she will throw over to the technical sound designer to do the implementation. So I don't think that it is a requirement, but I definitely think that it helps. And not only helps in like, oh, I can integrate my own sounds, but also it just kind of helps you understand other aspects of game development and of engines. I mean, just understanding, the way that conditional logic works, or understanding how to troubleshoot when things aren't working, because you can look into a script and see what's going on and kind of trace that through its steps to understand why something may or may not be happening. So it's definitely super helpful. In some cases, it is required, but not for everyone. I think there's also a lot of great resources online for people who want to learn. And, I've learned a lot, and it's generally all either been self-taught or taught by coworkers. When I was at Activision and we were switching engines, I think when we were about to start working on Spider-Man Web of Shadows, which was using Treyarch's engine. And Treyarch had this engine that basically used their scripting language was essentially C. So it was essentially a programming language. And the programming team knew that for us to be able to be effective in this engine, we were going to need to learn some about it. So they basically just gave us classes once a week for a few months of just the basics of programming. What is a variable? What is an if statement? How do you do this kind of logic stuff? And in some ways, that was a big springboard for me, because I remember working on a mission there, and I managed to rig some kind of complex sound thing. And the way I did it is I just found an example somewhere else in the code, and I copied that and I pasted it where I needed it, and I changed the names of the variables to play the sound I wanted to. And I had a programmer review it, and I was like, yeah, I can't believe I did this. All I did was just copy and paste that and change the variables. He's like, that's what programming is. That's all we do. So that was kind of an eye-opening experience. And I feel like that's still, the extent of my scripting knowledge. I don't consider myself a good scripter. I can usually get stuff done, but the way that I do that is just kind of sifting through other people's script and looking for clues so that I can kind of cobble together what I need to do.
Yeah. So, all right, let's talk about toys. What's your DAW and what are your favorite plugins making sounds?
I mean, so we use Reaper, and I've used just about every DAW. I think I started on Cubase. I've used Pro Tools a lot. I was a Logic user for like 10 or 15 years. I tried using Reaper about 10 years ago and used it a little bit. I was like, okay, this is interesting. And then I think it finally clicked for me a few years ago. And so now that's our main DAW. Plugins wise, I mean, my whole take is like, hey, whatever you like, if it does the job that you need it to do, that's great. That's what you should use. I could not live without RX. I don't know how we did live without RX because it's just like saved so many recordings and just cleaned things up so much in so many cases. I mean, I like a lot of the isotope stuff. I think as far as what things I use a lot, I definitely use the neutron transient shaper a ton. There's some stuff like from Synaptic, like Morph, that I'll use for doing really weirder stuff of blending sounds together. Um, um, uh, I use the Melda plugins a lot because they're once you kind of can wrap your head around their interface,
Yeah, that's
there's just
complex
a
one.
lot there. And I love the Fab Filter stuff. Um, but I think it's interesting to hear what people use, but I don't think that there's any like, it's not like, oh, hey, if you put a sound through this thing, it's going to sound amazing. It's more about knowing the tools and how to use them and knowing when to use them.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, it was so much fun talking to you, Brad, and I've learned a lot from you. And your work is always inspiring, and your dedication and the way you care about your coworkers and projects is exemplary. Thank you very much for your time.
Hey,
It was
thank
a
you. This
pleasure.
was really fun.